Welcome to Indivisible Charlotte's In the Know Live. I'm Carolyn Eberly, founding director of Indivisible Charlotte. For those of you who may not know us, for the last 9 years, Indivisible Charlotte has been educating and engaging our community in civic and electoral activism, all with the goal of bringing justice and equity to our democracy. You can always learn more about upcoming events and our work through our website, indivisibleclt.org. Indivisible Charlotte's research team focuses on educating our community on various political, policy, and economic issues facing our democracy. Our In the Know live interview today is on voter suppression with Bob Phillips and Tyler Daye of Common Cause, North Carolina. This subject is so important and the information is so wide-ranging that we're presenting this in two parts. This first part will deal with current attacks on voting rights, off-cycle redistricting, erosion of Voting Rights Act, and potential reforms to enhance voting rights. We're so excited to be speaking with Bob Phillips and Tyler Daye today of Common Cause. Now I'll turn it over to Marshall Aron, Indivisible Charlotte's research coordinator.
Thanks, Carolyn. In this episode, we're going to cover some of the issues and challenges on elections, voter suppression, and gerrymandering. I'm joined by my colleague, Pat Rosa, from our Indivisible Charlotte research team. Pat's going to introduce our guest from Common Cause, North Carolina.
Thanks, Marshall. And I'm honored to introduce our guest to you today. First, we have Bob Phillips, who is the Executive Director of Common Cause, North Carolina. He's held this position for the last 25 years and is retiring this month. His efforts at Common Cause have involved lobbying legislators and building support throughout the state for government reforms to enhance our democracy, especially in the areas of free and fair elections and enhancing voting rights. Also, we have Tyler Daye, a colleague also with Common Cause North Carolina. Tyler is the Policy and Civic Engagement Manager and has been a very strong advocate for redistricting reform. Tyler is responsible for monitoring the boards of elections in North Carolina and assessing the impact of changes in state election laws. Previously, he worked with Democracy North Carolina and the League of Women Voters of North Carolina on redistricting reform initiatives and ending gerrymandering in North Carolina. Bob and Tyler, we're really thrilled to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Welcome, Bob and Tyler. And I'll start off with the first question. Voting rights are under attack. Since returning to office, Donald Trump signed an executive order to severely curtail voting rights. The Postal Service has changed their postmarking rules, which can affect mail-in voting. The SAVE Act was passed by the House last April and is awaiting Senate consideration. Can you discuss these actions and other recent approaches to voter suppression?
Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, there's several different things, but I'll touch on the SAVE Act first. The SAVE Act essentially would require all voters to provide proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. And so this would be a birth certificate or a passport. And the problem there is that there are millions of Americans that don't have either one of those two things. I personally do not have a passport. And for many people, going to get a birth certificate could require traveling far distances, and also there could be a cost involved. And this bill is meant to secure our elections and prevent non-citizens from voting, but there is plenty of evidence that non-citizens are not voting in our elections, and that this bill would just make it harder for American citizens to vote. And I know that some states have passed their own state-level SAVE Act where they require proof of citizenship. Kansas did this not that long ago, and it was a real disaster there. They ended up blocking the voter registrations of more than 31,000 citizens who were eligible to vote, but they weren't able to meet this proof of citizenship requirement. And thankfully, at this point, the bill is not going forward. It has passed in the House, but it is not moving in the Senate. And I know the president's executive order tries to go around this by implementing this proof of citizenship requirement on the federal voter registration form. However, that has been blocked by a judge, and so that's not going forward. And I think that there are some questions as to whether the president has that ability. We're talking about changing the law here, and executive order is not meant to do that type of thing. We'll definitely be watching to see if in North Carolina, if we see the legislature try to propose some sort of state level SAVE Act like we've seen in other states. But this would definitely be very harmful.
In kind of a related way, closer to home, a federal court's reviewing North Carolina's Senate Bill 747, which became law 2 years ago, courtesy of the Republican supermajority. And that was an attempt to do a different type of suppression by derailing same-day registration. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'll take that. So yeah, Senate Bill 747 it did pass, and there is a provision in it that would have allowed election officials to cancel the registrations of same-day registrants if I should step back and say, when you register and vote same day, the election officials have to mail an address verification to your address in order to verify that you live there. And if this mailer that the county board sends ends up being bounced back as undeliverable, then Senate Bill 747 says that the election officials could cancel that registration, and then essentially that vote would not count. However, that was blocked by a judge, and it's been going through the court system. And as you mentioned, there was a case heard in October regarding this provision. And the real concern there is that same-day registrants tend to be younger voters, college students, and even voters who have graduated from college, who are moving with their job and may not be settled down, because every time you move, you got to re-register. And any provision that would make it more difficult and could end up nullifying someone's vote simply because of an error in this could even be something as simple as the election official, when they sent out the mailer, they put down the wrong address, or there was a problem with the postal service in delivering it. It just did not get delivered, or it got delivered to the wrong address. Not having a safeguard there where it just doesn't happen at one time, not having a safeguard would be very problematic for voters. And I know that Senator Daniel, he was questioned. He's one of the senators on the Senate Elections Committee who was involved in drafting this bill. And he mentioned, according from what I have seen regarding the trial, he mentioned that he was asked about if he sought input from election officials or postal workers before putting these provisions in, and apparently he did not get that input, which again is really concerning.
Yeah. And since I think you said, or you alluded to this, that college or young people, college students, they move around a lot. And so it's not unusual for them to have different addresses that change. So this is a pretty big thing. Pat, do you want to go on to the next question?
Yeah, sure. The next question has to do with Donald Trump's off-cycle redistricting order to states like Texas. And when that happened, it set off a firestorm of gerrymandering. So first, we wanted you to give us a quick overview of gerrymandering and some of the approaches used, like cracking and stacking, as well as how computer and AI-generated maps are affecting the process.
I can give an overview. And so essentially, when we talk about gerrymandering, I first want to back up and just talk about redistricting first, which is the process by redrawing our voting districts every 10 years after a U.S. census. It's important to, I think, ground ourselves with that, because gerrymandering is the manipulation of that process to draw districts that favor a particular group of people. And that could be partisan gerrymandering, where you are drawing districts to favor a political party. It could be racial gerrymandering, where you're drawing districts that discriminate against someone based upon their race or make it difficult for a group of voters to elect a candidate of their choice. And you mentioned cracking and packing. Cracking is when you have a voting block and you draw the districts in a way that just splits them apart. And we have seen plenty of examples of this in our state. I think one of the best examples is of North Carolina A&T University in 2016, which was cracked. They drew the congressional district boundary down Laurel Street, which separated the campus between two different districts. And those are two different congressional districts, which again makes no sense. Packing is when you pack your opponents, the opposing party, into as few districts as possible. And what that results in is that your party or the opposing party wins those districts by big margins, but you win all the other districts by much smaller margins. And the idea is that you are reducing the amount of districts that your opponents have an ability to win in. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. There used to be, in fact, one of the things that got me interested in this is that I used to live in the old 12th district, which went down I-85 from Greensboro to Charlotte. And I don't think anyone would tell you that Greensboro and Charlotte should be in the same congressional district. Actually, my aunt at the time lived in Charlotte and I was in Greensboro, and I just could not believe we were in the same congressional district. But that is packing. And that particular district was also an example of racial gerrymandering because that district had been drawn in a way so that, yes, portions of Greensboro and Charlotte were there and it went down I-85. It also included portions of High Point and Winston-Salem, but it only picked up certain parts of those cities. And in particular, it focused on Black voters. And so it's really like a segregation, honestly, of voters where you're packing Black voters into this district and again, reducing the voting power of voters here. And also, again, pairing voters with communities that it makes no sense for them to be in. So, yeah.
Thanks, Tyler. Anything on how the AI generated maps affect the process? I guess I would imagine that they must be much more precise than without the use of computer and AI generated maps. Is that true? Or would you say something different?
I know that if you're using AI to draw these districts, there's a lot of data out there on us that includes partisan and racial data, but also data on things like our shopping habits. When we are downloading apps or on the web and we hit accept on those terms and conditions that a lot of people don't read, we are providing companies with our data. And that type of data can be used to try to decipher our voting patterns and try to create a profile that tries to determine what type of voter we are. And I have not seen from the back end of how that would be used, but I know that that type of data could be used. And if you were to input that into an AI, then it could help develop districts based upon all that data. And there's so much data out there on us.
Tyler, I just want to interject one thing. Do you think that it's being used not only for gerrymandering, but also for testing fair districts?
That's a good question. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I know that typically when we think about fair districts, we're thinking about not using all of that type of data. We're looking at just using the population data and also using racial data to the extent to make sure that racial groups are able to elect candidates of their choice, not to crack and pack. I hadn't really thought about using that data in terms of drawing fair districts, but I don't think that you really need that. When you're drawing fair districts, it really should be primarily about the geography and keeping communities together. That's the main focus, is looking at the communities, looking at municipalities, neighborhoods.
Thanks. Pat, continue. You had some more questions on gerrymandering.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go to you, Bob, and just specifically, we wanted to focus on redistricting activities in other states, like what's the latest in the Texas situation with its legal appeals, as well as redistricting in some of the other key red and blue states.
Sure, Pat, if I may, I might want to just add on to what Tyler mentioned, Marshall, to your last question. We actually have litigated Common Cause North Carolina. We've been in a lot of litigations over the years, and we really have used actually some experts who can run the algorithms and spit out 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 maps to show that the map we're challenging is an extreme gerrymander. And so you can actually use data, algorithms, AI to create a better map. I think what's missing, and Tyler, I know you would agree with me, is though you need the human piece, an independent citizens commission, obviously, where people who know the area, know the district, it shouldn't be just numbers. But Marshall, to the question you asked, indeed, we in trial, Common Cause v. Lewis, 5 years ago, when we actually were successful in a superior court in overturning the legislative maps, we had an expert witness from Duke University, a mathematician named Jonathan Mattingly, and he had done an algorithm putting in fair district criteria and was able to show that the map that we were challenging, the map that North Carolinians had, was an extreme gerrymander. Sorry about that, Pat. I know you were asking about
No,
where.
thanks. I appreciate you giving that.
No.
Go ahead, Pat.
So it's dreadful. Mid-decade redistricting is just horrible. Up until this current phase we are in, we've never really had mid-decade redistricting unless there was a court order. And certainly we've seen that in North Carolina. We're the most litigated state in America regarding gerrymandering, unfortunately. That's not a great distinction to have, but indeed we are that. I know that maybe about a half dozen states have done it. Texas first. You've got California, I think Utah. Indiana's kind of an outlier. They actually did not bow to the president's call. But this is the first time we've ever had a president who has actually demanded that mid-decade redistricting occur. And unfortunately, we saw it here in North Carolina in October. And where Common Cause has been on this was that traditionally, we do not want to see any kind of mid-decade redistricting or any kind of gerrymandering, if you will. But in this extraordinary time that we were in, the organization took a position that we can't stop it. We tried to in North Carolina. We are representing, just like you all are, people and getting them engaged. And except in Indiana, and God love the Hoosiers for doing it, we just haven't seen the people actually successfully stop it. So the position of Common Cause then has been to, if you are going to engage in mid-decade redistricting, you must meet fair districting criteria. And that's what we put out. And any state that meets that, we're not endorsing it, but if a state does not, then we will condemn it. And that's what has happened. Pat, I think about 3 more states, Virginia, Florida, I can't remember the other one, that might be talking about doing this. I know that a lot of the pundits have suggested that it's a wash. Maybe the Republicans aren't going to really be gaining much out of it ultimately, but that's where things are. But it's certainly a dreadful situation that we're in right now in this country with mid-decade redistricting.
Yeah, and thank you, Bob. And I think, like you said, does it really make sense, like California, what California went through for blue states to battle back? What's your opinion or thought about that? Is it worth it, or does it compound the voter suppression problem?
I didn't like seeing any of it. And I understood from a political standpoint, and we're a nonpartisan organization, of course, but the whole, as they call it, unilateral disarmament is hard to see when you know what's at stake, and that's the control of Congress. And we have elections for the purposes of allowing people to have an opportunity to use their voices to change the directions of where this country, or in this case, a state, might be going with representation. But that's taken away when you have this blatant, overt gerrymandering that's happening. And so that's where we, and I know the League of Women Voters, I think, got caught up in what do we do? How do we respond? Ultimately, we believe in independent redistricting as a means of getting all this out of the hands of the politicians. And we certainly do not want to see mid-decade redistricting become a thing That was the point we were trying to make in our most recent litigation of the legislative and congressional maps, that if you allow this, the party that doesn't like the outcome is just going to say, okay, we're going to redraw the maps if they have the prerogative to do that. And that's the fear.
Yeah, and just one follow-up, and it's around your current thinking about the impact in North Carolina and other parts of the country with these redistricting efforts on the 2026 midterms. What's the thinking around that? Because some analysts believe that it has the potential to backfire as safe seats might become more competitive.
Tyler, I'll let you chime in on this too, but I'll just say, what's that old saying? Careful what you wish for. I
Yeah.
do think when you're drawing maps for the purposes of just one thing, and that is to gain seats, and our legislators here in North Carolina, they were so blatant about it. We're doing this because Donald Trump is our president and he needs the control of the Congress. And this is the sole reason we are doing this. This was just for us unbelievable, but that's where it's gone. But when you draw these maps, and as Tyler mentioned, the whole strategy of winning small and losing big, you're drawing maps based on gaining seats and not really for what I will say resiliency. And if the voter turnout or the coalition, the kind of people who vote, if that is not the behavior, if that is different, and you have an election where people are just coming out of the woodwork to vote, and coalitions like young people or older people or rural voters or whatever are voting in bigger numbers, or maybe certain people are not going to vote a certain way that they did last election. And I think we are in a moment, Pat, where in 2026 that might happen, because look at our neighbors to the north in Virginia. I
Right.
don't think anyone thought that I think they call it the delegation up there, but that their legislature was going to change that much, where the Democrats gained a lot of seats in their House of Delegates. And I think in Georgia, those two, and I'm saying this in a nonpartisan voice, those two Democratic, I think they are election board, and they elect their election board statewide members there, and they won. This might have been the first time a Democrat had won statewide. And that's a suggestion that people are upset, they're voting differently. And I'm sorry, I'm going on and on about this. I guess to answer your question succinctly, I think 2026 could yield some surprises to the gerrymanders.
Yeah, no, those are all really good points. Yeah, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
And
Marshall? Oh,
if
go ahead,
I could
Tyler.
just say
Sorry.
one
Yes.
thing on all of this, I think one thing that's really important to remind people is that the reason why we are in this mess is because the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Common Cause v. Rucho in 2019 that partisan gerrymandering was legal nationwide. And if that ruling had gone differently, if the court had said, no, this is wrong, partisan gerrymandering violates the U.S. Constitution, none of this would be legal. None of this would be possible.
Yeah.
And then again, in 2023, our state Supreme Court said partisan gerrymandering is legal in North Carolina, because at the time in 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court said, we're saying at the federal level that we're not going to weigh in on this, but at the state level, state courts can go further. And our state court ultimately decided, nope, we're going to permit this. So I just think that it's really important that people know that the courts have a huge role in determining whether or not we will have fair districts.
No,
that's
thank you for that reminder, because again, we talk about that a lot with elections coming up for like not the state court seats, and how important that is last year or this year, always. Thank you.
one thing I just wanted to say, Pat,
Oh,
and
yeah, Bob.
on this point too, and you make a great point there. In the 2026 election, one of the marquee races that people don't necessarily know about is going to be that one state Supreme Court justice seat that's open. Anita Earls, who's the
Right.
incumbent, is running for reelection. Sarah Stevens, a House member from Surrey County, is going to be her Republican opponent. It will probably be the most expensive state Supreme Court contest in the history of North Carolina. There's some projections that more than $20 million will be spent on this one single race. And to kind of go back into when I first came to Common Cause back in 2001, people were going crazy over $1 million state Supreme Court race. And that's how we got, briefly, what we call public financing for our appellate court races. We had that in North Carolina. But what I'm really suggesting is, as what Tyler mentioned, these races are incredibly important. You've got one seat that's running in 2026, 3 more seats that are open in 2028 or that'll be up for grabs. And that could swing the whole balance of the court, which could then have an effect on whether we have a court that says gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, just like Tyler mentioned, is okay, or maybe you get a court that, just like they did in 2022, say, no, partisan gerrymandering is a violation of the North Carolina Constitution. I'm sure Charlotte Indivisible and Common Cause North Carolina would agree. We want a court, and I'm saying this in a nonpartisan fashion, that reflects our views that partisan gerrymandering is a violation of our Constitution. It should not be allowed.
Yeah, and I thought the Allison Riggs election was challenging, so good to know all that. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, we wanted to move next to the Voting Rights Act and its relation to gerrymandering. And Tyler, you did a good job, great job talking about the partisan side of it. But then the Supreme Court recently heard arguments on a case which can potentially overturn Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And I was wondering if you could discuss the North Carolina U.S. impact if that happens, and again, how that relates back to the state Supreme Courts as backstops.
Yeah. The Voting Rights Act is, I think, one of the seminal pieces of legislation that has ever been passed in in this country. And for years, it has been a real pillar and a guide to legislators and to the courts in governing how we do redistricting. And one of the questions in this case centers around drawing districts in a way where you're ensuring that minority voters are able to elect candidates of their choice. And this is particularly important in cases where you have racially polarized voting. And that means that voters of one race vote for different candidates than voters of a different race at such stark rates that the minority voters are never able to elect their candidates of choice because they are a minority, unless you draw the district in a way that gives them that opportunity. And this is really, I think, relevant to the northeastern part of the state and Congressional District 1, which was the subject of this last mid-decade redistricting. But we have evidence of racially polarized voting going on in the northeastern part of the state. In the last presidential election, white voters voted for, in Congressional District 1, voted for Donald Trump by, I believe it was about 90% compared to Kamala Harris, while Black voters voted for Harris about 98% to Donald Trump. When you have numbers like that are really truly jump off the page, that shows you that there are different preferences for the people there. And again, when you see that relating to not just the presidential race, but then to congressional races and state legislative races, it really illustrates the importance, I think, of upholding the Voting Rights Act and why it is so important that it be kept in place.
So just to be clear on this, you talked about Rucho versus Common Cause undermining the partisan side of it. Does this undermine the racial side of the Voting Rights Act? So this is a two.
Yes, this Rucho v. Common Cause. There isn't. Rucho v. Common Cause dealt with partisan gerrymandering,
Right.
and so it did not. And I certainly not one of our lawyers who argued the case, but in my understanding, this was not a case that centered around the Voting Rights Act. This was a case about whether or not partisan gerrymandering violated the U.S. Constitution. The Calais case that you're referencing, and this is really all about race. This is about the Voting Rights Act and the ability to draw these opportunity districts for minority voters. And if this case were to be struck down, this would have a significant impact. You would see this would change the South, essentially. You'd see legislatures across the South go back and redistrict and just wipe out any of these opportunity districts. And I haven't looked to tell you how many there are, but I'm sure that there are a dozen, 2 dozen maybe of these districts. So this would be a monumental change.
Would be as bad as the post-Reconstruction changing in voting suppression.
I would say, I'm sorry, Tyler, go ahead.
You go ahead. You go ahead, Bob.
I mean, Marshall, to your point, North Carolina did not elect an African American to the U.S. Congress until 1992. Mel Watt out of Charlotte was one of those. Eva Clayton was the other. And I'll say this, when the legislature was crafting their egregious congressional gerrymander in October, Common Cause, we brought Congresswoman Clayton at 91 years old to speak out against it. And it was one of the highlights of the time I've been with Common Cause, actually, to be around her for that. But to your point, this is our legacy in North Carolina and the South and this country, discriminating against minority voters. We're a state with what, 23, 25% minority African Americans. And to Tyler's point, what would we have left if the Section 2 is wiped out by this Supreme Court case? I've been around long enough to think Citizens United was the worst Supreme Court decision in my time at Common Cause. Certainly Rucho was another huge disappointment, but this may even be worse because, Marshall, to your question and to your point, there's no relief to be sought at a court. If partisan gerrymandering it's illegal and we no longer have Section 2 to actually challenge a map on racial discrimination, what's left other than in North Carolina, kind of, Pat, going to the point I made a few questions ago, elections, and where you get, at least in North Carolina, be it good or bad. I know a lot of people think electing a state Supreme Court is ridiculous, but at least it does give voters an opportunity to elect in North Carolina a state Supreme Court that might have a different viewpoint about what partisan gerrymandering is and racial gerrymandering as well.
So even the state Supreme Court can't really help us if it goes through.
No, I don't. No, there would not be. Section 2 would be gone, and there would be no ability to challenge. And certainly, our last, as Tyler has mentioned, challenge of the legislative and congressional maps, we were co-plaintiffs with the NAACP. It was NAACP v. Berger. It was based on racial gerrymandering, and we felt like we had a great case of showing how these were blatant examples of violations of racial gerrymandering. And of course, this 3-judge federal panel rejected that unanimously, unfortunately. But without Section 2, we won't even have that opportunity to make those challenges.
And the case we're talking about, Louisiana v. Calais, is at the Supreme Court level, and the current status of it
it's interesting.
Been arguments?
Question, Marshall. I know we were taping this on January 8th, Friday, January 9th, this U.S. Supreme Court at 9:30 in the morning. Tyler, you know what you and I will be doing, and everybody else. They will begin to deliver their opinions on court cases that have been in this last session. Calais could be one of them. We're all holding our breath on that because we got to prepare. But Marshall, to answer your question, U.S. Supreme Court reheard oral arguments in October. The decision is going to happen sometime this year. We could get the results on January 9th.
Okay.
Wow.
I just wanted to clarify really quickly what I had mentioned before regarding those numbers of 90% it was actually 91% of white voters in Congressional District 1 voting for Trump and 98% for Harris. That was in the previous congressional district, not the one that was just redrawn. Those numbers may be even different. They may be even more stark if you look at the newly drawn map. But like I said, the point there is that when you have such stark differences in voting patterns, it is really impossible for the minority voters to be able to elect the candidate of their choice unless white voters vote with them. And we just aren't seeing that in the northeastern part of the state.
Pat, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, what can we do then to battle voter suppression? Is there really even hope for something like a John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act or the freedom to vote? What reforms can meaningfully be done to enhance voting rights?
So I think that both of those pieces of legislation would be phenomenal if they were to pass. They would, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would go a long way to restoring the Voting Rights Act, because one thing that we didn't talk about before is that part of the Voting Rights Act has already been chipped away back in, I believe it was 2013, when in Shelby County v. Holder, the Supreme Court ruled that preclearance was no longer needed. And what that meant is it used to be that states with a history of discrimination had to get their voting laws pre-cleared by the Justice Department before they would go into effect. And this was a provision of the Voting Rights Act that was put in there because we had a long history of voting laws that were designed to discriminate against minority voters. And you go back to the poll taxes and the grandfather clauses and things like that. And so the Congress said, we want to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. And you states that have a history of doing this, including North Carolina, you're going to have to get these laws pre-cleared. And in 2013, the Supreme Court said, you know what, we've come so far. As we don't need this pre-clearance anymore. And I think that in hindsight, I would hope that the justices would look back and say, maybe we should have kept that, because right after that was struck down, states started passing more aggressive laws that restricted voting rights, and it hasn't stopped since. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would re-establish that pre-clearance, which I think would be huge. And then the Freedom to Vote Act has a number of different provisions in it. One of the things that it would do would require at least 15 consecutive days of early voting in federal elections, including 2 weekends. And that's huge. I know we've had a lot of battles over early voting in this state, and we currently have a early voting period of up to 17 days. But the legislature has flirted with changing that. And so this would, at a national level, at least set a standard where you have to have at least 15 consecutive days of early voting. It would also make a lot of changes for redistricting. So it would set criteria that states would need to follow when it comes to redistricting, and things like not showing a preference to incumbents, not drawing districts to favor candidates, not requiring that districts be drawn to represent communities and keep communities of interest together, having hearings before and after the maps are released. In this state, during this last mid-decade redistricting, the legislative leaders announced in the press release that they would be doing this the next week. They came in, and Senator Ralph Hayes, who drew the map, presented the map, and they passed the map a week after they sent a press release saying they were going to do it. There were no public hearings, and it was all done. Clearly, it was done even behind closed doors before any of us knew about it. This would require hearings before and after maps are drawn, and then also, and I really like this part, a written evaluation that measures the plan and how it does in terms of protecting minority voters and also preserving communities of interest, because those are really 2 pillars of what a plan needs to do. It has a lot of great things in it, and yeah, it would be great to see that pass.
I just wanted to say real quick too, unfortunately, the reality though is the John Lewis Act is not going to pass. It might pass the House if the Democrats can take control in 2026. It'll never reach the 60-member threshold that the U.S. Senate requires, because that would require Republicans coming on board with this. And I just don't see that in this toxic partisan environment that we're in. And it's really a shame, because that is really, as Tyler has done a great job in explaining how it would be so beneficial, but that's just the reality. In North Carolina, it would be wonderful if we could get, in terms of, Pat, the question you asked with regards to what can we do The secret sauce is always trying to convince the majority party that it is in their interest to pass some of these things. We haven't been very successful at it, unfortunately. But if we can show Republicans who have used same-day voter registration, they've used it, Tyler, you've done a lot of research on it in equal numbers now to Democrats and unaffiliateds, but that something like making same day also election day, where someone can register on election day. Tyler, you're a precinct judge. That would eliminate all those provisional ballots that are many of them, I should say, if we could do that. Other things in terms of restoring that 3-day grace period that we used to have up until, 2 years ago, I guess, when they eliminated it in Senate Bill 757, I think. And that was where when you have a mail-in ballot and it has the proper postmark, it's accepted 3 days in election. Those are small things, but in this environment that we are in, we have to try to convince the majority party that these are good things that your voters also would benefit. And again, it's a tough, steep mountain to climb, but this is what elections are all about. I say this again, I know I've said it before in a nonpartisan voice, but people need to be informed. They need to understand what's at stake. And maybe in 2026, we might see a change.
Hey, Bob, you've got a long-term perspective on this, but I'd want to bring up the subject of John Roberts, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's had a long-standing campaign against the Voting Rights Act. Can you talk a little bit about that and perhaps give us some sense of what he's done and why?
Before he was at the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think he worked, Marshall, I know we were talking about this in the Reagan administration, and he had a view that the Voting Rights Act was outdated, and he's kind of reflected that, obviously, in Shelby, the case that Tyler mentioned, which did away with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Just thinking that it's not really needed. He has acknowledged that racial discrimination exists, but that there has been progress, I think is how he says it, that has been made. And I think prior to his arrival to the U.S. Supreme Court, he was about this idea that the effort to have anything overturned or have something ruled unconstitutional, that intent has to be the bar that you reach, not just the effect. In other words, and this is what happened to us in terms of the outcome of our gerrymandering trials this past summer, we showed the effect of gerrymandering. We showed that these were gerrymandered, racially gerrymandered districts. But the court ultimately said, you guys you did not prove that the legislature intended to do that. And that comes out of the John Roberts thinking way back when Reagan was president. And that's the worry with what we've talked about with Calais. Where is he going to be on this? How might he shape this potential decision to suggest that Section 5 is no longer needed? Or not Section 5, I should say, that Section 2, which is what we have. I don't think we've gotten those reversed. Have I, Tyler?
It's Section 2, yeah.
And that's the worry right now in terms of he has never really demonstrated, Marshall, a strong belief that maps should be drawn on the predominant basis of race, as Tyler has mentioned, to make sure that you draw districts that are not diluting the voting strength of minorities. He seems to not really philosophically agree with that. And that's where we are seeing potentially the entire Voting Rights Act being wiped out. Maybe we might even see something as early as this month.
Yeah.
I did just want to mention one more thing on the Voting Rights Act. And I just wanted to say that it's important, I think, to recognize that this practice, when we're talking about majority minority districts, this is done there are limitations on this. This is only in areas where there is need for it. We're not talking about all in all areas of the state or all areas of the country. It's only in areas like in northeastern North Carolina where there is evidence of racially polarized voting, and then in many parts of the South where we still see this. But I just think it's important that people understand that it's only in specific areas where there is racially polarized voting in a geographic area where you have a minority population that's connected where this applies.
So that concludes part 1 of our voter suppression podcast. Please check back for part 2, which will be coming soon. And please subscribe to our Substack. Thanks for joining us.